Summer 1944. Somewhere in Nazi Germany, cameraman Georg Kopp took this footage of members of the Hitler Youth and the Federation of German Girls helping to bring in the harvest as part of their land service. Kopp was a so-called colour film reporter for the Deutsche Wochenschau, a weekly newsreel shown in German cinemas. He had been commissioned to provide emotive pictures for the Panorama project.
In Berlin at roughly the same time, cameraman Heinz Sasse and his assistant Karl Friedrich Falke were filming the morning dance performances by girls at Medau Gymnastics College. Such scenes were only to be shown abroad in neutral countries. They suggest that in no way did the Third Reich regard the war as lost. Many cinema goers in Germany would probably have sneered at such pictures, because the precarious situation at the front and the devastating destruction caused by Allied bombing raids could no longer be kept secret.
Swinemünde on the Baltic. Manned by recruits, German motor torpedo boats are setting out on an exercise. With its warships now barely operational and unable to be deployed in the North Sea or the English Channel, the German Navy was relying mainly on these powerful flotillas. They were used to attack coastal shipping off the British Isles. As the son of a film producer from Kiel, cameraman Gerhard Garms was in his element. Garms was fully aware that his pictures had nothing to do with reality.
London, May 1944. Springtime calm before the storm. These pictures were taken with this amateur camera by American war reporter Jack Leib. The decision had been taken. In a few weeks' time, the Allies would attempt a landing in Normandy. All that remained was for the precise date to be set. Church services in Westminster Abbey were also attended by American troops. On this warm Sunday in May, many Londoners were relaxing in Hyde Park. They no longer had to fear German bombing raids, and as yet they had no idea of the existence of Hitler's wonder weapons, the V1 and the V2. Jack Leib's task was to provide black and white material for US weekly newsreel News of the Day. But he also had a small amateur film camera with him and 16mm material which he used to take pictures for his family.
At the end of May 1944, a host of American war correspondents headed to the south of England to report on the biggest amphibian landing operation in history. Selected journalists, press photographers and camera teams would be present on Decision Day. They were only allowed to take along what they could carry on their backs. Everything, of course, had to be kept top secret. The enemy had to be kept totally in the dark. Also present was star journalist Ernie Pyle, a Pulitzer Prize winner. On May the 31st, Pyle wrote in his notebook,
"So I now know the secret the whole world has waited years to hear. And once you have heard it, you become permanently a part of it. Now you were committed. It was too late to back out now, even if your heart failed you."
At this point, more than 3 million troops were on standby on the south coast of England, ready to drive the Nazis out of France. On June the 3rd, the US war correspondents were waiting in Weymouth, where part of the Allied armada was lying at anchor. Ernie Pyle wrote,
"And in more pensive moments we also conjectured on our chances of coming through alive. We felt our chances were not very good, and we were not happy about it.
Military commanders expected losses to be high. Some put the chance of establishing a bridgehead at just 50%. In his diary, British Field Marshal Alan Brooke had this to say about the forthcoming invasion.
At the best, it will come very far short of the expectations of the bulk of the people, namely all those who know nothing about its difficulties. At its worst, it may well be the most ghastly disaster of the whole war.
The plans for Operation Overlord involved 5 divisions going ashore in Normandy. The aim was for the invasion force to reach the Seine and Loire rivers within 90 days. Driving the Germans back eastwards, the Allies would then liberate Paris. The Americans had been allocated 2 sectors on the west of the invasion front, Utah Beach and Omaha Beach.
June the 6th, 1944, D-Day.
Now only professionals were allowed on the scene. Several weeks earlier, Hollywood director John Ford had already been given the most important task of his career. He was to record the massive event on film with as many camera teams as possible. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel's task was to prevent the landings. His orders were clear.
The technically most difficult point, the moment when troops make for the beach in boats, should be used for defense with every means possible. Pre-beach obstacles, beach mines, and concentrated fire from all weapons as the enemy comes ashore should increase the problem of this maneuver many times over.
Machine gunners on Omaha Beach fired at anything that moved. Thousands of American soldiers were killed or seriously wounded. In an interview 20 years later, John Ford remembered,
"Once I was on the beach, I ran forward and started placing some of my men behind things so they'd have a chance to shoot their film. All I could think was that for the most part everything was all so well coordinated, fitted perfectly, went beautifully. To my mind, those seasick kids were heroes. I saw very few dead and wounded men. Later I could see 1 dead floating in the sea."
On HMS Belfast, one of the Royal Navy's flagships, Hollywood director George Stevens experienced D-Day off Juno Beach. He was taking part in the landing with an Army film team to document the Allies' historic achievement for people back home, but in black and white. This colour footage was only found in his estate many years later. Just before the men went ashore, the captain recited the St. Crispin's Day speech from Shakespeare's Henry V.
"And Crispin Crispian shall ne'er go by, from this day to the ending of the world. But we in it shall be remembered. We few, we happy few, we band of brothers. For he today that sheds his blood, with me, shall be my brother."
On the late morning of June the 6th, George Stevens and his men also went ashore. Juno Beach was in Allied hands. The team started to film. The German defenders had left Bernières-sur-Mer in a hurry. Now supplies were coming ashore. In the village itself, a bar had been open since 9 a.m. In front of it, a French resistance fighter holding his nation's flag posed for the camera. A tank from a minesweeping unit, apparently disabled by a landmine. When Adolf Hitler learned of the Allied landings, he was in high spirits.
The news couldn't be better. As long as they were in England, they were out of reach. Now at last, we have got them where we can defeat them.
On the afternoon of June the 6th, the American war correspondents landed on Utah Beach. Jack Lieb took these pictures with his amateur camera. By chance, the US forces landing on this northernmost sector of the invasion front had had a surprisingly easy time of it. The tide had swept their landing craft to a more southerly point, which was virtually undefended. Some GIs were disappointed that the operation had not been tougher. One eyewitness remembered later that
there was little trace of the elation that had been expected. On the other hand, there was no major confusion either.
The Royal Air Force attacked the city of Caen, which was being fanatically defended by the Germans. A colour film reporter took these pictures, which were used in a Panorama weekly newsreel. The Germans' 21st Armoured Division was stationed in the town. The Allies became engaged in vicious street-to-street fighting and suffered heavy losses. It was not until July the 19th that German resistance in Caen was finally broken.
George Stevens and his men followed the advancing American troops westwards into the Bocage, a region of fields and hedgerows where there was fierce fighting. The Hollywood director was worried about his team because the almost impenetrable Bocage was perfect terrain for ambushes and booby traps.
Time and again, the Germans registered successes against a superior force. On June the 30th, Star reporter Ernie Pyle wrote to a friend,
"This hatch-to-hatch stuff is a form of warfare we haven't had to cope with before, and I've seen more dead Germans than ever in my life. Americans as well, but not so many as Germans. One day I'll think I'm getting hardened to dead people. Dead young people in vast numbers, and then next day I'll notice I'm not and never could be. I have continually to fight a kind of inner depression over the ghastliness of it all."
On July the 7th, 1944, British Commander-in-Chief Field Marshal Bernard Law Montgomery decorated American soldiers for their courage on D-Day. George Stevens and his team filmed the ceremony. Also present was US General George S. Patton, who had only arrived in Normandy the day before. The old warhorse had had to spend a whole month in England, basically kicking his heels. In his diary, Patton wrote,
"It is hell to be on the sidelines and see all the glory eluding me."
On his arrival at the Omaha Beach sector, Patton had inspired his troops with a fiery speech.
"I'm proud to be here to fight beside you. Now let's cut the guts out of those crowds and get the hell on to Berlin. And when we get to Berlin, I'm going to personally shoot that paper-hanging goddamn son of a bitch just like I would a snake."
In early July 1944, war correspondent Jack Lieb travelled with General Joseph Collins's entourage to the northern tip of Normandy. Around 21,000 German troops had dug in around the port of Cherbourg and were putting up solid resistance. But on July the 26th, the Germans finally surrendered to a superior force. An American officer noted that,
"Some of my boys couldn't understand why the Germans surrendered so quickly."
Collins celebrated the victory together with the mayor of Cherbourg and some of its citizens. The general was known affectionately to his men as Lightning Joe.
Hitler is said to have been as enraged at the fall of Cherbourg as he was when Field Marshal Paulus surrendered at Stalingrad. The small town of Barfleur lies roughly 30 kilometers east of Cherbourg. Its port had been fortified by the Germans, and the Allies now planned to use it for bringing in supplies.
Together with his colleagues, Jack Leap viewed the defences that had been installed on the beaches and the bunkers the Germans had built. To assess the situation in and around Barfleur, one of Hitler's field marshals had paid a personal visit to the area as late as May 1944, but as it turned out, Barfleur was never one of the targets of the first wave of the invasion. Rommel was impressed by the enemy operation in Normandy.
Technically and strategically, the landings in Normandy were an outstanding achievement.
When the Germans withdrew from Saint-Lô, the town was in ruins. George Stevens and his team filmed in Saint-Lô in early August. It was here that the Allies made the decisive breakthrough in the battle for Normandy. A bridge hurriedly repaired by US sappers secured the supply line to the west. Saint-Lô served the Germans as an important traffic junction for the redeployment of troops, so the town had been bombed and shelled time and again. In a letter home, a German lance corporal wrote,
"Today I spoke to someone who had fought on the Eastern Front. He said things had also been tough in the East, but never as tough as they are here. If a German soldier deserts to the enemy, his family doesn't get any support. And if we were to win the war, he would have to be handed over to be dealt with."
Week after week passed, with the Allies making only slow progress. But in the end, the Americans achieved the decisive breakthrough. On July the 26th, 1944, they took the small town of Marigny. Shelling and strafing had reduced many buildings to rubble. George Stevens and his team filmed the destruction. The fighting morale of the German troops declined rapidly. On July the 26th, a paramedic noted this remark by a soldier who had been wounded.
"I'll tell you one thing, medic. Here in Normandy, it's not war anymore. The enemy is superior in both men and material. Without adequate weapons, we are simply being sent to our deaths. Our military leaders are doing nothing whatsoever to help us. For me, the war's over."
For most Americans, the only good German was a dead one. The Waffen-SS were particularly hated because of the repeated reports of wounded GIs being murdered. The black uniforms, it seems, were coveted trophies.
In the major offensive in July, 40,000 American servicemen had been killed or wounded. The troops who had survived were exhausted from weeks of fighting.
George Stevens had received instructions from the highest level that, first of all, he was to follow General Patton's troops as they advanced towards Brittany. The men in his unit respected the Hollywood director, yet Stevens, who always seemed to be grumpy, remained something of an enigma to them. One of his colleagues remarked later that
he was uncommunicative and looked serious even when he was making a joke.
On August the 15th, 1944, an armada of nearly 900 ships approached the coast of southern France. On board one vessel were American film director William Wyler and his camera teams, The operation was only about half the size of the invasion of Normandy. 3 American divisions went ashore on the first day alone.
The BBC informed the French resistance about the imminent launching of this second invasion by broadcasting coded messages. Garby is sleeping in the grass, Nancy has got a stiff neck, and the hunter is hungry.
German prisoners of war had to help unload the ships. In contrast to D-Day, in the coastal town of Saint-Tropez, the GIs met with hardly any resistance. There was one brief firefight which cost less than 100 American lives. Afterwards, supplies could be brought ashore unimpeded. The Nazi leadership displayed a lethargic reaction to the news from the south of France. In his diary, Joseph Goebbels remarked laconically that
the enemy claims that the contingent that has now landed is more powerful than the one that came ashore in Normandy. But they're only saying that to scare us. It will, of course, take us a few days to implement our countermeasures, because obviously we can't position adequate numbers of troops at every place on the coast to repel an enemy landing operation.
Even after the Normandy landings, the dangers for the civilian population still existed. The Germans had mined many towns and villages to impede the advancing Allied troops. George Stevens and his camera team were filming in the town of Coutances when a German landmine suddenly exploded. The GIs took cover just in case there might be other blasts. US paramedics were on the spot immediately because one soldier had obviously been wounded.
In Coutances, US sappers had made most of the roads passable again. The Americans had assembled 15,000 men in the area to open up supply routes blocked by wrecked German vehicles. Even though countless houses had been destroyed in the fighting, most French people were relieved to be liberated by the Allies. By now, they were no longer afraid that the invasion might fail and the Germans would return. But many wondered about the immediate future. Would the Americans ensure a supply of food to the population? And who would be in control in Normandy in the future? The occupying forces or the French themselves, under the leadership of Charles de Gaulle?
George Stevens had been given permission to film a German prisoner of war camp. This was the Hollywood director's first encounter with the defeated enemy, a foe who had put up such fierce resistance over the last few weeks. The few possessions the soldiers had with them were carefully inspected. By now, most of the German prisoners were glad that for them the war was over. The fighting had demoralized them. According to a US report,
many Germans created a lethargic impression. Large numbers of those taken prisoner were exhausted. The Americans found that young soldiers in particular had believed Nazi propaganda. In fact, one prisoner said to a GI, "There's not much of New York left standing, is there?" "What are you talking about?" the GI asked. "Well," the German replied, "it was bombed by the Luftwaffe, wasn't it?"
Captured German soldiers were transported away from the front and later put on ships. Thousands were sent to prisoner of war camps in Britain or the United States. where they remained until the war was over.
At Mont Saint-Michel, Jacques Lieb filmed American star photographer Robert Capa, who had documented the horrors of the landing on Omaha Beach on the morning of June the 6th. The American war reporters had gone on an outing to the medieval island fortress. Also present was author Ernest Hemingway, who was famous for his ability to hold his drink. Hemingway had come close to being killed by a German shell. Here it seems he has liberated a bar. Later, Robert Capa said Hemingway had accused him of not having helped him when the author sought cover from the shell in a ditch. That, Hemingway claimed, was because Capa wanted to take the first picture of the celebrated writer's corpse.
Meanwhile, to the north, the Allies had achieved a decisive breakthrough. But even so, many German units had managed to escape east. Paris was now within range, but a bizarre argument took place about the next steps to be taken. The talk was of an imminent uprising in the French capital, which might then be suppressed by the Germans with extreme measures.
General Charles de Gaulle told the commander-in-chief of the Allied forces, who actually wanted to bypass the French capital, "We must march into Paris." So on August the 22nd, 1944, Dwight D. Eisenhower gave the order for the French 2nd Armored Division to take Paris. The French were to liberate their capital themselves. The final stage of the advance through the suburbs of Paris was a victory parade. George Stevens and his cameraman were allowed to be present when French forces entered the capital on August the 24th. Later, he told his son that it had been the greatest day of his life.
Here, Stevens and his team are waiting at Montparnasse railway station for a delegation from the Wehrmacht. The city's commandant had been ordered to defend Paris to the last man and then blow up the most important buildings. But after a meeting with Hitler, General Dietrich von Choltitz was certain that he was showing loyalty to a madman. So he had decided to surrender the city without a fight. The surrender document was signed inside the railway station, where it was actually too dark to film. In the meantime, General de Gaulle had also arrived. He had organized French resistance from Britain. Now the day of his triumph over the hated Nazi occupiers had come. In order to capture the historic moment on film, George Stevens wanted those involved in the ceremony to repeat it outside. When Choltitz hesitated, the tipsy director is said to have remarked,
"C'est la guerre générale, that's war."
De Gaulle's strategy had paid off. Sitting in every ministry were people of his choice. The provisional government of the French Republic had assumed power, and not the Americans. Then it was time to celebrate. Later, Stevens' assistant, British screenwriter Ivan Moffat, remembered,
"One knew at the time it was going to be the most exhilarating day. I mean, it couldn't help but be, particularly as we thought that the war was pretty much over and that the Germans were in headlong retreat. The atmosphere was intoxicating, exhilarating, with these thousands and thousands of people embracing us, embracing each other under an absolutely brilliant sky. Paris looking absolutely marvelous, not at all shabby. an atmosphere almost like a bullfight.
At the request of US General Omar Bradley on August the 26th, 1944, de Gaulle took part in a parade of the US 28th Infantry Division on the Champs-Élysées. Reporter Ernie Pyle had experienced the boundless joy of the French on the day of their liberation. Now he was disappointed.
As usual, those Americans most deserving of seeing Paris will be the last ones to see it, if they ever do. By that I mean the fighting soldiers. Only one infantry regiment and one reconnaissance outfit of Americans actually came into Paris. And they passed on through the city quickly and went on with their war. The first ones in the city to stay were such non-fighters as the psychological warfare and civil affairs people, public relations men and correspondents. I heard more than one rear echelon soldiers say he felt a little ashamed to be getting all the grateful cheers and kisses for the liberation of Paris, when the guys who broke the German army and opened the way for Paris to be free were still out there fighting without the benefit of kisses or applause. But that's the way things are in this world.
Like many of his colleagues, George Stevens also took time out to sleep in a real bed and to write to his family.
The days and nights all ran over themselves and became pretty much one thing: the struggle to get to Paris. The doing and the 2 weeks before were the most exciting, the most unbelievable time of my life. I do hope you and Georgie have seen the newsreels that carried our film.
At the same time, Stevens' Hollywood colleague William Wyler and his camera teams were filming in the south of France, where remnants of the Wehrmacht were still trying to hold Marseille. While French troops were combating the last pockets of resistance, the resistance had already occupied strategic positions in the city centre. Street after street was searched to check for German snipers.
The next day, the Germans surrendered. After liberation, the search began for those who had collaborated with the hated enemy. A suspect's mother says goodbye to her son, who is then taken away by resistance fighters. Power in Marseille passed into the hands of left-wing forces of the resistance movement. The Americans were tolerated, but, as far as possible, were expected to stay out of the city and to push further north. Concerned that his country might become divided, General de Gaulle diffused the situation with a trick. The paramilitary groups were quickly integrated into the French army.
Hitler had already ordered a withdrawal from southern France on August the 17th, 1944. Nearly 300,000 German troops were able to pull back. The wounded were left behind in field hospitals to be captured and were taken to prisoner of war camps. The Allies' successes had had a demoralizing effect on the enemy. Many simply gave up. Their attitude now was,
"It's all over, so bugger them. Now we're going to surrender."
As Hitler's blitzkrieg warriors, in 1940 they had overrun France in just a few weeks. Now the sad remnants were being taken prisoner. In the summer of 1944, the Wehrmacht lost nearly 240,000 men, killed or wounded. 200,000 German troops were first interned in provisional detention camps. After his resounding success with Memphis Belle, William Wyler wanted to make a documentary film about the American fighter aircraft who were attacking German units or convoys behind the front. But his teams never succeeded in showing US Thunderbolts in action. His camera teams were only able to capture the results of their attacks. In the opinion of cameraman Karl Maslowski, Wyler used far too many rolls of colour film without rhyme or reason.
In my whole career, I have never seen such a disgraceful waste of precious film material.
But sometimes there were exceptions. Near Lyon, a squadron of Thunderbolts had destroyed a Wehrmacht bus. Wyler's team photographed the enemy dead.
A second team followed the advancing Americans towards the Swiss border. In the Jura Mountains in eastern France, the village of La Charme had been almost completely destroyed by US fighter aircraft. Its inhabitants gave their liberators a somewhat lukewarm reception. But in other places, it was a different story. This German Lance Corporal is lucky. He has even been given a glass of red wine.
By September 1944, virtually the whole of France was free again. Only in Alsace and Lorraine, the two regions annexed by the Wehrmacht in 1940, were the Americans still facing fierce resistance. William Wyler ended his filming. His sole aim now was to get to Mulhouse, the town where he was born and where his parents ran a haberdashery business before emigrating to America.
The color film reporters with the Panorama weekly newsreel were still filming in the autumn of 1944. Here, cameraman Karl Sonntag is out on the Baltic with some of the German Navy's net-laying ships. "18 net-laying vessels had been tasked with blocking harbour entrances or important shipping routes to prevent submarines, torpedoes or frogmen getting through. Scenes like these were intended to make cinema-goers in neutral countries think that Hitler and the Wehrmacht had taken every measure to prevent the Allies from achieving further successes.
The Nazi propaganda ministry was still placing its faith in entertainment. Cameraman Karl Falke was sent to Breslau in Silesia to film a performance by the Bush Circus. Master Ullman, with his 12 Arab stallions and tightrope walker Dolinda, delighted the audience, which also contained SS and regular army soldiers.
Around this time, journalist Ruth Andreas Friedrich noted in her diary that
"We are making an effort, with thoughts and wishes, with hopes, aspirations and expectations. Hardly a day passes without us talking about final victory, our final victory. Will we see it this year, or will we have to wait until next year? On the Western Front, they seem to be taking a breather."
with a massive array of men and material, the Western Allies had liberated France and reached the borders of the Reich. Their biggest problem now was not the Wehrmacht, but supplies. Because of the speed of their advance in August and September, the Allies had to wait for fresh troops, arms and ammunition to be transported to the front from ports in Normandy and the Provence. To the disappointment of the British, the final decision on further action rested with the Allies' American commander-in-chief. Montgomery, in the meantime promoted to Field Marshal, wanted to make a quick thrust into the Ruhr industrial region. But General Eisenhower continued to place his faith in the superior strength of his forces.
George Stevens and his team also had to wait. Midway between Paris and Reims, they halted for a while in Château-Thierry on the River Marne. High above the small town stands a huge monument commemorating the dead of the First World War. In May 1918, the area saw months of fierce fighting between German troops and units of the American Expeditionary Force, which had been sent to the front in support of the hard-pressed French army. Stevens and his men were well aware that the Second World War still wasn't over. Pessimists reckoned that the fighting could last into 1946 and cost many more American lives. Next to the graves from July 1918, there were now new wooden crosses for GIs who had only recently lost their lives.
American war reporter Jack Leib and his colleagues traveled to the Ardennes to meet up once again with General Lightning Joe Collins. The headquarters of the US 1st Infantry Division was located in Houffalize in Belgium. Collins and his team were preparing to advance across the border into the German Reich. The civilian population had no idea that the Germans would return during the Ardennes offensive of December 1944 and that Allied bombers would reduce their town to rubble. But for now, everything was going to plan, and American troops were given the order to attack the imperial city of Aachen.
At the Nazi bulwark known as the Siegfried Line, Jack Leib filmed these children, symbols of innocence in a time of horror. Hitler's suicide and Germany's unconditional surrender was still 8 months away, 8 months in which millions of soldiers, civilians and concentration camp inmates would become further victims of the dictator's crimes against humanity.